Marcus stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, watching the city sprawl beneath him like a chessboard. The morning light cast sharp shadows across his face, highlighting the controlled expression that had become his trademark. 20 years ago, he had been a different man, entirely reactive, emotional, vulnerable to every slight and setback that life delivered. Today, he commanded a multinational corporation worth billions, influenced political decisions across 3 continents, and moved through the world with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned the most valuable lesson of all: true power begins with absolute mastery over oneself. The transformation had not been accidental. It had been deliberate, methodical, and often painful. Marcus had studied the great strategists throughout history: Sun Tzu, Machiavelli, Talleyrand, but, more importantly, he had studied himself. He had dissected his emotional responses, identified his weaknesses, and systematically rebuilt his psychological architecture from the ground up. The man who now controlled a corporate empire was not the same man who had once lost sleep over a colleague's casual criticism or felt his confidence shatter at the first sign of adversity. This metamorphosis represented something far more profound than simple emotional intelligence or stress management. It was the cultivation of what the ancient Stoics called ataraxia, unshakable tranquility, combined with the strategic thinking that Niccolò Machiavelli had codified centuries earlier. Marcus had learned to weaponize his emotions rather than be weaponized by them, to use his understanding of human psychology as a tool for influence rather than allowing himself to be influenced by others' psychological manipulations. The office door opened quietly behind him. Sarah, his chief of staff, entered with the day's briefing materials. She moved with the efficient precision that characterized everyone in Marcus's inner circle, people who had learned to match his level of emotional discipline or found themselves gradually excluded from positions of real influence. "The Henderson acquisition is meeting resistance from their board," she reported, her voice neutral and professional. "They're questioning our valuation metrics and suggesting we're attempting a hostile takeover disguised as a merger." Marcus turned from the window, his expression unchanged. Where another executive might have shown frustration, anger, or concern, his face remained a mask of thoughtful composure. This was not indifference, it was control. Behind that calm exterior, his mind was already analyzing the situation, identifying leverage points, and formulating responses that would turn resistance into compliance. "Henderson's board is reacting emotionally to the threat to their autonomy," he said, settling into his chair with deliberate movements. "Fear makes people defensive, but it also makes them predictable." "What specific concerns did they raise about our valuation?" Sarah consulted her notes. "They claim our assessment of their intellectual property portfolio is inflated, particularly their research and development division." Marcus nodded slowly, his fingers steepled in front of him. This was precisely the kind of challenge that would have derailed him decades earlier. In his younger self, he would have felt personally attacked, would have responded with defensiveness or aggression, would have allowed his ego to drive his strategy. Those reactions would have been visible to his opponents, giving them ammunition to use against him. But the man sitting in this office today had learned to divorce his self-worth from external validation, to view criticism not as personal attacks but as information to be processed and utilized. "Their resistance isn't really about valuation," Marcus observed, his tone carrying the quiet authority of someone who understood human motivation at its deepest levels. "It's about control and identity. Henderson built that company from nothing. To them, we represent an existential threat to their legacy. The intellectual property concerns are just the rationalization their minds have constructed to justify an emotional response." This insight exemplified the core principle that separated true power from its mere appearance. Most people in positions of authority relied on external markers, titles, wealth, formal hierarchies, to project strength. But Marcus had learned that authentic power flowed from internal mastery. When you could not be emotionally manipulated, when your responses were governed by strategic thinking rather than reactive impulses, when your self-image was independent of others' opinions, you became virtually unassailable. Sarah waited for his instructions, recognizing the signs that indicated Marcus was formulating a comprehensive response. She had observed this process countless times over the years, the way he would absorb information without immediate reaction, process it through frameworks that seemed to account for psychological subtleties that escaped most business leaders, and then articulate strategies that appeared almost prescient in their effectiveness. Schedule individual meetings with each board member, Marcus said finally. Not group sessions where they can reinforce each other's resistance, but private conversations where we can address their specific concerns. Research each member's background, their personal motivations, what they need to hear to feel secure about the transition. Mrs. Henderson will need assurance that her husband's vision will be preserved. Johnson will want guarantees about employee retention. Williams is primarily concerned about his own position post-merger. The strategy Marcus outlined demonstrated another crucial aspect of emotional mastery, the ability to understand and predict others' psychological patterns while remaining immune to their attempts to manipulate yours. He had studied human nature not out of cynicism, but out of necessity. In a world where emotions drove most decision-making, the person who could think clearly while others reacted emotionally possessed an insurmountable advantage. As Sarah left to implement his instructions, Marcus returned to the window. The city below seemed unchanged, but he knew that hundreds of thousands of people down there were currently being controlled by their emotions, making decisions based on fear, anger, desire, or pride that they would later regret. They were reactive rather than strategic, vulnerable rather than strong, at the mercy of circumstances rather than in control of them. This had not always been his perspective. Marcus could still remember with painful clarity the man he had been 20 years earlier. Fresh out of business school, filled with ambition but lacking wisdom, he had believed that success was simply a matter of working harder and being smarter than the competition. He had been naive about the role that psychology played in business, politics, and life in general. More importantly, he had been naive about his own psychological vulnerabilities. The lesson had come in the form of a devastating professional failure. Marcus had been working for a prestigious consulting firm, convinced that his analytical skills and work ethic would propel him rapidly up the corporate hierarchy. He had poured himself into a major project, a restructuring plan for a struggling manufacturing company, and had developed what he believed was a brilliant solution to their operational challenges. The presentation to the client's executive team had been a disaster. Not because his analysis was flawed or his recommendations were poor, but because he had completely misread the political dynamics within the client organization. The CEO had already decided on a different course of action before Marcus's team had even been hired. The consulting engagement was merely corporate theater, designed to provide cover for decisions that had already been made for reasons that had nothing to do with operational efficiency. Marcus had reacted to this revelation with visible frustration and indignation. He had argued passionately for his recommendations, cited data and case studies, appealed to logic and reason. His emotional investment in being right had been obvious to everyone in the room, and the CEO had used that against him with surgical precision. By the end of the meeting, Marcus had been made to appear naive and unprofessional, his credibility damaged not because his work was poor, but because he had allowed his ego and emotions to be weaponized against him. The failure had been professionally costly, but personally transformative. In the weeks that followed, Marcus had begun to understand that his analytical skills and technical competence, the qualities he had always relied upon, were necessary but not sufficient for real success. The world was not a meritocracy where the best ideas automatically prevailed. It was a complex ecosystem of competing interests, hidden agendas, and psychological warfare where emotional discipline was often more valuable than intellectual brilliance. That realization had prompted Marcus to embark on a systematic study of power dynamics and emotional mastery. He had read everything he could find about strategic thinking, from military tacticians to political theorists to negotiation experts. But, more importantly, he had begun the difficult work of examining and reshaping his own psychological responses. The process had been neither quick nor comfortable. Marcus had forced himself to confront uncomfortable truths about his motivations, his insecurities, and his patterns of thinking. He had practiced maintaining emotional equilibrium in increasingly challenging situations, treating his reactions as data to be analyzed rather than truths to be defended. He had learned to separate his identity from his accomplishments, his self-worth from others' opinions, his ego from his strategy. The man standing at the window now was the product of that transformation. He had not suppressed his emotions that would have made him robotic and ineffective. Instead, he had learned to experience emotions without being controlled by them, to use emotional intelligence as a tool rather than being used by emotional impulses. When anger arose, he could recognize it, analyze its source, and choose how to respond rather than simply reacting. When fear threatened to cloud his judgment, he could acknowledge it while continuing to think strategically. When pride tempted him to make suboptimal decisions, he could step back and choose the course of action that served his long-term interests rather than his short-term ego. This internal transformation had external consequences that compounded over time. People began to perceive Marcus differently. Where they had once seen a smart but reactive young professional, they now encountered someone who seemed unflappable, whose responses were measured and strategic, who appeared to possess some deeper understanding of the forces that shaped human behavior. This perception created a feedback loop that enhanced his actual power. People began to defer to his judgment, to seek his opinion on complex matters, to view him as someone who could be trusted to make difficult decisions under pressure. Marcus had learned to leverage this perception carefully. He understood that true influence was not about domination or manipulation, but about becoming the kind of person others naturally looked to for guidance. When you had mastered your own psychology, when your responses were predictable and strategic rather than reactive and emotional, people felt safer placing their trust in you. They could rely on you to maintain composure when they lost theirs, to think clearly when circumstances became chaotic, to make decisions based on long-term considerations rather than immediate impulses. The intercom on his desk chimed softly. Sarah's voice came through with an update. Mr. Henderson has agreed to a private meeting this afternoon. He seemed surprised by the personal attention but receptive to the conversation. Marcus smiled slightly, not with satisfaction at a tactical victory, but with the quiet confidence of someone executing a well-considered strategy. Henderson's willingness to meet privately indicated that Marcus's assessment of the psychological dynamics had been accurate. The aging founder was indeed operating from emotional rather than rational motivations, and those emotions could be addressed through careful relationship management rather than adversarial negotiation. The afternoon meeting would require Marcus to demonstrate another crucial aspect of emotional mastery, the ability to create psychological safety for others while maintaining absolute clarity about his own objectives. He would need to acknowledge Henderson's concerns with genuine empathy while subtly guiding the conversation toward outcomes that served his own interests. This balance required extraordinary self-awareness and emotional discipline, the kind that could only be developed through years of deliberate practice. As Marcus prepared for the meeting, he reflected on how different his approach had become from the conventional wisdom about business leadership. Most executives he knew operated from a foundation of insecurity disguised as confidence. They made decisions quickly to appear decisive, spoke loudly to project authority, and surrounded themselves with yes-men to protect their egos. But Marcus had learned that real power was quieter, more subtle, and infinitely more effective. True emotional mastery, he had discovered, was not about becoming invulnerable to psychological pressure. It was about understanding pressure so thoroughly that you could navigate it with precision and grace. It was not about eliminating emotions, but about developing the capacity to experience them without being hijacked by them. It was not about manipulating others, but about understanding human psychology so completely that you could create genuine value while advancing your own interests. The man who had destroyed his weak self, the reactive, ego-driven, emotionally vulnerable version of Marcus that had existed 20 years ago, had indeed become impossible for others to destroy. Not because he had built impenetrable defenses, but because he had eliminated the internal weaknesses that others could exploit. When your sense of self was not dependent on external validation, criticism lost its sting. When your strategic thinking was not clouded by emotional reactivity, opponents could not manipulate you into poor decisions. When your responses were guided by long-term thinking rather than immediate impulses, temporary setbacks became merely data points in a larger strategic framework. The transformation from emotional reactivity to emotional mastery represented perhaps the most significant competitive advantage available to any individual. In a world where most people were still controlled by their psychological patterns, the person who had achieved genuine emotional sovereignty operated from an entirely different level of capability. They could think clearly when others were confused, remain calm when others were agitated, and maintain focus on long-term objectives when others were distracted by immediate concerns. Marcus checked the time and began gathering materials for his meeting with Henderson. The acquisition would succeed, not because of superior financial resources or market position, but because Marcus understood something fundamental about human nature that his counterparts had not yet grasped. The strongest fortification was not external armor, but internal architecture. The most powerful weapons were not those that could destroy enemies, but those that could neutralize the weaknesses within oneself that enemies sought to exploit. Part 2, The Mechanics of Psychological Warfare. The Henderson meeting had concluded exactly as Marcus had anticipated. Within 90 minutes, the elderly founder had shifted from suspicious resistance to cautious collaboration. The transformation had not resulted from aggressive negotiation or financial pressure, but from Marcus's systematic application of psychological principles that most business leaders never fully understood. Marcus had begun the meeting by acknowledging Henderson's emotional investment in his company's legacy. Rather than dismissing these concerns as irrational or irrelevant, he had validated them while gradually reframing the acquisition as a means of preserving rather than destroying what Henderson had built. He had spoken in terms of stewardship rather than ownership, evolution rather than revolution, partnership rather than takeover. By the end of the conversation, Henderson was discussing implementation details rather than raising objections. The success of this approach illustrated a fundamental principle of emotional mastery: the most effective influence operates at the level of identity and values rather than logic and reason. People make decisions based on how those decisions align with their self-concept and worldview, then use rational arguments to justify choices they have already made for emotional reasons. Marcus had learned to work with this psychological reality rather than against it. As evening approached, Marcus found himself in a different kind of strategic situation. He was attending a dinner party hosted by Senator Catherine Morrison, one of the most influential political figures in the state. The guest list represented a cross-section of corporate leaders, political operatives, and cultural influencers, precisely the kind of environment where power was exercised through subtle social dynamics rather than formal authority. These gatherings were laboratories for psychological observation and strategic positioning. Marcus had learned to navigate them with the same methodical approach he brought to business negotiations, but the rules of engagement were more complex and the stakes often higher. A carelessly expressed opinion could create enemies that would pursue grudges for decades. A well-timed alliance could open doors that no amount of money or formal credentials could unlock. Marcus arrived fashionably late, not out of arrogance, but as a calculated demonstration of independence. Those who arrived early appeared eager for social validation. Those who arrived too late seemed either disorganized or deliberately dismissive. The optimal timing projected confidence without disrespect, importance without desperation. Senator Morrison greeted him warmly, her practiced political smile revealing nothing about her true assessment of his presence. Marcus had studied her career trajectory and understood that her success had been built on an extraordinary ability to read people's motivations and leverage that understanding for political advantage. In many ways, she was a kindred spirit, someone who had achieved mastery over the psychological aspects of power. "Marcus, I'm so glad you could join us tonight," she said, her tone suggesting genuine pleasure that Marcus knew was carefully calibrated. "I believe you know most of our other guests, but I'd like you to meet Dr. Elizabeth Chen. She's been advising us on some fascinating research about decision-making psychology." The introduction was not casual. Senator Morrison was skilled enough at social orchestration that every conversation, every pairing, every seemingly spontaneous interaction had been designed to serve specific strategic purposes. Marcus understood that his placement next to Dr. Chen was meant to accomplish something, though the senator's ultimate objective remained opaque. Dr. Chen proved to be a professor of behavioral economics at the university, specializing in the intersection of psychology and financial markets. As they talked, Marcus recognized that she possessed the kind of analytical intelligence that could be either valuable or dangerous, depending on how it was directed. Her research focused on the emotional and cognitive biases that caused experienced investors to make predictably irrational decisions. "What I find most fascinating," Dr. Chen was explaining as they moved through the senator's elegantly appointed living room, "is how even sophisticated professionals can be manipulated by relatively simple psychological techniques. We've documented cases where billion-dollar investment decisions were influenced by factors as superficial as the physical attractiveness of the presenting team or the color scheme of presentation materials. Marcus nodded thoughtfully, recognizing an opportunity to gather intelligence while projecting intellectual engagement. That suggests there's significant value in understanding these psychological vulnerabilities, both to avoid falling victim to them and to leverage them strategically. Exactly, Dr. Chen replied, her eyes brightening with the enthusiasm of someone whose expertise was being genuinely appreciated. The research indicates that emotional decision-making is not a bug in human psychology, it's a feature. Our brains evolved to make rapid decisions based on incomplete information, which served us well in primitive environments but creates systematic blind spots in complex modern contexts. As their conversation continued, Marcus found himself genuinely interested in Dr. Chen's perspective while simultaneously analyzing how her insights could be applied to his own strategic objectives. This dual-track thinking, simultaneously engaging authentically while maintaining strategic awareness, represented another crucial skill in the emotional mastery arsenal. The ability to be genuinely present in social interactions while never losing sight of larger strategic considerations allowed Marcus to build real relationships without becoming vulnerable to manipulation. He could express authentic interest in others' expertise while maintaining clarity about his own interests. He could demonstrate intellectual curiosity without revealing information that could be used against him. Across the room, Marcus noticed a conversation that was developing between two other guests, James Patterson, CEO of a major technology firm, and Richard Blackwood, a prominent investor known for his ability to identify emerging market trends. Their body language suggested tension beneath the surface cordiality, and Marcus made a mental note to understand the source of their conflict. "Excuse me for a moment," he said to Dr. Chen, "I'd like to pay my respects to some other colleagues." As Marcus circulated through the room, he practiced another fundamental technique of social influence, strategic listening. Most people attended these gatherings to talk, to project their own importance, to make impressions. Marcus had learned that there was far more value in careful observation and selective engagement. By listening more than speaking, he could gather intelligence about others' motivations, concerns, and vulnerabilities while revealing little about his own strategic thinking. The conversation between Patterson and Blackwood proved illuminating. Through casual eavesdropping, Marcus learned that they were on opposite sides of an emerging market dispute involving artificial intelligence patents. Patterson's company had developed proprietary technology that Blackwood's investment fund wanted to license for a portfolio of startup companies. The negotiation had apparently stalled over valuation and exclusivity terms. This information was potentially valuable on multiple levels. Marcus's own company had interests that could be affected by developments in the AI patent landscape. More immediately, understanding the psychological dynamics between Patterson and Blackwood could inform future interactions with both men. Patterson appeared to be operating from a position of defensive pride. He had built something valuable and was reluctant to share control. Blackwood seemed frustrated by what he perceived as unreasonable demands from someone he considered a technical expert rather than a business strategist. Marcus approached the two men with the casual confidence of someone joining a friendly conversation. "Good evening, gentlemen. I hope you're both enjoying Catherine's hospitality as much as I am." Both men responded with practiced social pleasantries, but Marcus could sense the tension beneath their polite exteriors. This was precisely the kind of situation where emotional mastery provided tremendous advantages. While Patterson and Blackwood were partially distracted by their unresolved conflict, Marcus could engage with both of them from a position of psychological clarity and strategic flexibility. "James, I've been following your company's work in machine learning with great interest," Marcus said, addressing Patterson directly while maintaining awareness of Blackwood's reactions. "The applications for predictive analytics in corporate strategy seem almost limitless." Patterson's response revealed the kind of ego investment that Marcus had learned to recognize and navigate carefully. "We're definitely pushing the boundaries of what's possible," Patterson replied, his tone suggesting both pride in his accomplishments and defensiveness about others' attempts to capitalize on his innovations. "The key is maintaining control over the intellectual property while we scale the technology." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the subtext of Patterson's comment as a reference to his dispute with Blackwood. Rather than addressing the conflict directly, which might have forced both men into more entrenched positions, Marcus chose to explore the underlying interests that were driving their disagreement. The intellectual property landscape in AI is fascinating, Marcus observed, speaking to both men while appearing to address neither specifically. Companies that can establish standards early often find themselves in extraordinarily powerful positions as markets mature. But there's also significant value in strategic partnerships that accelerate adoption while preserving core competitive advantages. This approach, discussing the substantive issues while avoiding direct reference to the personal conflict, allowed both Patterson and Blackwood to consider alternative perspectives without losing face. Marcus was essentially providing them with a framework for resolving their dispute while appearing to offer general business insights rather than specific mediation. Blackwood responded first, his investor's instincts recognizing the wisdom in Marcus's observation. The risk-reward calculation is complex, he acknowledged. Too much exclusivity can limit market penetration, but too little can undermine the competitive moat that makes the technology valuable in the first place. Marcus could see that both men were beginning to reframe their conflict in terms of shared strategic interests rather than zero-sum competition. This shift represented the kind of psychological transformation that he had learned to facilitate through careful conversational guidance. By helping people see their situations differently, you could influence their decisions without appearing to manipulate their thinking. The evening continued with similar interactions, strategic conversations disguised as social pleasantries, intelligence gathering masked as intellectual curiosity, relationship building that served multiple purposes simultaneously. Marcus moved through the gathering like a chess master playing multiple games concurrently, aware of each piece's position while maintaining focus on long-term strategic objectives. As the party began to wind down, Senator Morrison approached Marcus for a private conversation. This had been inevitable. The senator was too sophisticated a political operator to invite him without having specific objectives in mind. "I hope you've enjoyed meeting Dr. Chen," she began, her tone carefully neutral. "Her research has implications that extend well beyond academic theory." Marcus recognized this as an opening gambit in a more serious conversation. Senator Morrison was testing his interest in Dr. Chen's work while simultaneously assessing his capacity for the kind of strategic thinking that her political position required. Her insights about decision-making psychology are certainly relevant to anyone trying to understand how complex systems function, Marcus replied, matching the senator's careful neutrality while signaling his awareness that they were discussing more than academic research. "I'm glad you see the broader applications," Senator Morrison said, moving slightly closer to ensure their conversation remained private. "There are situations where understanding psychological dynamics can be crucial for achieving outcomes that serve larger strategic interests." The senator's meaning was becoming clearer. She was exploring whether Marcus might be interested in applying his understanding of emotional dynamics to political objectives. This was both an opportunity and a potential trap. Political entanglements could provide access to extraordinary influence, but they could also create vulnerabilities and obligations that limited strategic flexibility. Strategic psychology is certainly a powerful tool, Marcus agreed, maintaining ambiguity about his willingness to commit to specific applications. The key is ensuring that short-term tactical successes align with long-term strategic objectives. Senator Morrison smiled with what appeared to be genuine appreciation for his diplomatic response. "Precisely. I suspect we'll find opportunities to explore that alignment further." As Marcus prepared to leave the gathering, he reflected on how the evening had demonstrated several crucial aspects of emotional mastery in complex social environments. Success in these settings required simultaneous awareness of multiple psychological dynamics, your own motivations and reactions, the conscious and unconscious agendas of other participants, the strategic implications of various conversational choices, and the long-term consequences of immediate tactical decisions. Most people attended such gatherings reactively, responding to conversations as they unfolded without strategic frameworks to guide their choices. They revealed information carelessly, made commitments impulsively, and left themselves vulnerable to manipulation by more psychologically sophisticated operators. Marcus had learned to approach these situations with the same methodical preparation he brought to business negotiations, but with greater subtlety and longer time horizons. The drive home provided an opportunity for Marcus to process the evening's intelligence and plan follow-up actions. Dr. Chen's research could prove valuable for understanding market psychology in his own business ventures. The Patterson-Blackwood conflict represented a potential opportunity for strategic positioning in the AI sector. Senator Morrison's overture suggested possibilities for political influence that would require careful evaluation of risks and benefits. But, perhaps most importantly, the evening had reinforced Marcus's understanding of how emotional mastery provided compound advantages in complex strategic environments. When you could navigate social dynamics without being emotionally hijacked by them, when you could gather intelligence while revealing little about your own thinking, when you could influence others' perceptions while maintaining clarity about your own objectives, you operated from a level of strategic capability that most people never approached. The man who had destroyed his weak self had indeed become impossible for others to destroy, not through isolation or defensiveness, but through developing psychological sophistication that allowed him to engage fully with others while never losing sight of his own strategic interests. True emotional mastery was not about becoming invulnerable, it was about becoming strategically flexible enough to turn any situation to your advantage while building genuine value for others in the process. Part 3, The Paradox of Strength Through Surrender. Marcus's transformation was not yet complete. Despite his considerable success in applying emotional mastery to business and social situations, he was about to encounter a challenge that would test the very foundations of his psychological architecture. The lesson would come not from an adversary or competitor, but from the most unexpected source imaginable, his 12-year-old daughter, Emma. The crisis began on a Thursday evening when Marcus returned home to find Emma sitting at the kitchen table, her homework spread before her, tears streaming down her face. The sight stopped him cold, not because he was unprepared for emotional situations, but because his daughter's distress triggered something in him that bypassed all his carefully constructed psychological defenses. Emma looked up as he entered, her expression a mixture of frustration and desperation that Marcus recognized with uncomfortable clarity. It was the same expression he had worn decades earlier when facing professional challenges that seemed insurmountable, the same vulnerability that he had systematically eliminated from his own psychological repertoire. "I can't do this, Dad," Emma said, her voice breaking with the particular hopelessness that only adolescence can convey. "I'm not smart enough. Everyone else understands this math stuff, but I can't make it work." Marcus felt his strategic mind immediately begin analyzing the situation. Emma was experiencing a confidence crisis related to academic performance. The solution was straightforward: identify the specific knowledge gaps, develop a systematic learning plan, provide appropriate encouragement and support. He had resolved similar problems countless times in professional contexts, situations where team members became overwhelmed by complex challenges and needed guidance to rebuild their confidence and competence. But, as Marcus looked at his daughter's tear-stained face, something unexpected happened. The emotional walls he had constructed so carefully began to crack. Not because they were poorly built, but because they had been designed to protect him from external manipulation, not from the authentic love and concern he felt for his child. The psychological armor that made him invulnerable in business and social situations suddenly seemed not just unnecessary but actively counterproductive. Marcus pulled up a chair next to Emma, setting aside his briefcase and the mental frameworks that governed his professional interactions. For the first time in years, he found himself operating without strategic calculation, responding from a place of pure emotional authenticity. "Tell me what's happening," he said, his voice softer than he had heard it in months. "What specifically is giving you trouble?" As Emma explained her struggles with algebraic equations, Marcus found himself experiencing a profound internal conflict. Every instinct developed through years of emotional mastery told him to maintain psychological distance, to approach the problem analytically, to guide Emma toward a solution without becoming emotionally invested in her distress. But another part of him, a part he had thought he had eliminated entirely, wanted nothing more than to absorb her pain and frustration, to take on her burden so she wouldn't have to carry it. The realization was disturbing. Marcus had spent decades learning to separate his emotional responses from external circumstances, to maintain strategic clarity regardless of what others were experiencing. But, sitting next to Emma, he discovered that true emotional mastery might require something more complex than simple detachment. The strongest response might not be the most strategically calculated one. Over the following hour, Marcus worked through math problems with Emma, but the real education was happening at a different level entirely. He watched his daughter struggle not just with algebraic concepts, but with the same psychological patterns that he had battled in his own transformation. She was allowing temporary failures to define her self-worth, interpreting specific difficulties as evidence of general inadequacy, responding to challenges with emotional reactivity rather than strategic thinking. But, unlike his corporate colleagues or social acquaintances, Emma could not be guided through these psychological patterns using manipulation or strategic influence. She was his daughter, and the relationship demanded absolute authenticity. Any attempt to manage her emotions or engineer her responses would violate the fundamental trust that made their relationship possible. This paradox forced Marcus to confront an uncomfortable truth about his own development. In learning to master his emotions, he had also learned to distance himself from them. In becoming strategically invulnerable, he had also become partially disconnected from the authentic human experiences that gave life meaning. The strong self he had constructed was indeed impossible for others to destroy, but it was also partially isolated from others' capacity to love, support, and genuinely connect with him. "Dad?" Emma's voice interrupted his internal analysis. "You look worried. Are you okay?" The question pierced through Marcus's psychological defenses with surgical precision. His 12-year-old daughter had recognized something in his expression that his business partners, political contacts, and social acquaintances never saw. Despite all his training in emotional control, something authentic was leaking through, and Emma's natural empathy had detected it immediately. Marcus felt himself at a crossroads that would define not just his relationship with Emma, but his understanding of emotional mastery itself. He could maintain his strategic distance, provide calculated support designed to solve Emma's immediate problem while preserving his own psychological independence. Or he could allow himself to be genuinely vulnerable, to experience the full emotional reality of loving someone whose happiness he could influence but not control. "I'm okay, sweetheart," Marcus said, and then made a choice that contradicted years of strategic conditioning. "But I'm also sad that you're struggling with this. It hurts me to see you in pain, and I wish I could make it easier for you." The words were simple, but they represented a fundamental shift in Marcus's approach to emotional engagement. Instead of maintaining strategic distance, he was acknowledging authentic emotional investment. Instead of projecting invulnerability, he was admitting that his daughter's well-being affected his own emotional state. Instead of controlling the interaction, he was allowing himself to be influenced by it. Emma's response was immediate and profound. Her expression shifted from isolated struggle to shared experience. She was no longer alone with her academic difficulties. Her father was emotionally present with her, acknowledging that her challenges mattered to him not because of their strategic implications, but because she mattered to him. "Thanks, Dad," Emma said, her voice still shaky but carrying a note of relief. "I was starting to think maybe I was just stupid, but if you're worried about me, then maybe this is actually hard and I'm just learning." The insight was remarkable. Emma had intuitively understood something about emotional dynamics that had taken Marcus years to learn: the difference between supportive presence and strategic intervention. By acknowledging his own emotional investment in her struggle, Marcus had given Emma permission to experience difficulty without interpreting it as personal failure. His vulnerability had become a source of strength for both of them. As they continued working through the math problems, Marcus found himself questioning fundamental assumptions about emotional mastery that had guided his development for decades. Was true strength really about becoming invulnerable to others' capacity to affect you emotionally? Or was it about developing the discernment to be selectively vulnerable, to choose when emotional investment served larger purposes and when strategic distance was more appropriate? The evening with Emma suggested that the highest level of emotional mastery might not be about elimination of emotional responses, but about conscious choice regarding when and how to engage emotionally. The man who had destroyed his weak self had indeed become impossible for others to destroy through manipulation or emotional leverage. But that same man needed to retain the capacity for authentic emotional connection with those who mattered most to him. This realization had profound implications for Marcus's understanding of power and influence. The strategic frameworks he had developed were extraordinarily effective for navigating competitive environments where others might attempt to use psychological manipulation against him. But those same frameworks could become counterproductive in relationships that required mutual vulnerability and authentic emotional exchange. The paradox was that true emotional mastery might require the confidence to be strategically vulnerable, to consciously choose emotional investment despite the risks it created. This was not the same as the unconscious emotional reactivity that Marcus had learned to eliminate. It was a higher-order skill that required all the self-awareness and strategic thinking he had developed, but applied to the more complex challenge of authentic relationship building. As Emma's confidence began to return and her approach to the math problems became more systematic, Marcus reflected on how this evening was changing his understanding of strength and weakness. The weak self he had destroyed years earlier had been characterized by unconscious emotional reactivity, vulnerability to others' manipulation, and dependence on external validation. But the strong self he had constructed might have overcorrected, creating distance that limited his capacity for the kind of authentic connection that made life meaningful. The truest strength, Marcus was beginning to understand, might lie in the integration of strategic emotional mastery with selective authentic vulnerability. The man who could not be destroyed by others was not necessarily the man who was isolated from others, but rather the man who could consciously choose when and how to be emotionally present based on his own values and strategic objectives rather than unconscious psychological patterns. This insight extended far beyond his relationship with Emma. Marcus began to see applications in his professional and social relationships as well. The emotional distance that protected him from manipulation also limited his capacity to inspire genuine loyalty, build deep trust, and create the kind of authentic influence that transcended mere strategic positioning. The strongest leaders throughout history had not been those who were emotionally invulnerable, but those who could be selectively vulnerable in ways that served their larger missions. They could experience and express authentic emotions while maintaining strategic clarity about their objectives. They could be genuinely affected by others' experiences while retaining the capacity for difficult decisions when necessary. As Marcus helped Emma pack up her homework, both of them feeling more confident about her mathematical capabilities, he realized that his education in emotional mastery was entering a new phase. The skills he had developed over the past 2 decades remained valuable and necessary. But they needed to be integrated with a more sophisticated understanding of when strategic distance served his interests and when authentic vulnerability could create even greater strength. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, but the ultimate expression of that strength might be the wisdom to remain selectively open to being affected by others when such openness serves love, growth, and meaningful connection. True emotional mastery was not about becoming invulnerable, but about becoming conscious enough to choose vulnerability wisely. Emma hugged him goodnight, her earlier distress completely resolved. As Marcus watched her head upstairs to bed, he understood that she had taught him something about emotional mastery that no strategic framework could have provided. Sometimes the greatest strength lies not in maintaining perfect psychological control, but in having the confidence to consciously surrender that control when love and authentic relationship require it. The path to absolute control, Marcus realized, might paradoxically require the wisdom to sometimes choose not to exercise that control. This was not weakness disguised as strength, but strength so complete that it could afford to be selectively vulnerable. The man who had mastered his emotions completely was the man who could choose when to be affected by others' emotions, when to remain strategically distant, and when to surrender strategic advantage for the sake of authentic human connection. In learning to be emotionally invulnerable, Marcus had developed the foundation for choosing emotional vulnerability wisely. The weak self that needed to be destroyed was the unconscious, reactive, manipulable self. But the strong self that emerged could afford to be consciously vulnerable because it possessed the emotional intelligence to distinguish between authentic connection and strategic manipulation, between love that deserved emotional investment and influence attempts that required psychological distance. As Marcus prepared for sleep, he reflected on how his understanding of power had evolved throughout the day. True power was not about dominating others or remaining emotionally detached from all external circumstances. True power was about developing such complete emotional self-awareness and strategic sophistication that you could consciously choose your responses to any situation based on your deepest values and longest-term objectives. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, not because he becomes invulnerable to all emotional influence, but because he develops the wisdom to distinguish between influences that serve his authentic interests and those that serve others' manipulative agendas. In the end, the greatest emotional mastery might be the ability to love completely while thinking strategically, to be fully present emotionally while maintaining clarity about your own boundaries and objectives. This integration of strategic emotional mastery with conscious vulnerability represented the highest level of psychological development. It required all the skills Marcus had developed over the past 2 decades: self-awareness, strategic thinking, emotional regulation, psychological sophistication, but applied them to the more complex challenge of building authentic relationships while maintaining personal sovereignty. The weak self had been destroyed, but in its place had emerged not just strategic invulnerability, but the far more valuable capacity for conscious emotional choice. Marcus could now engage with others from a position of strength so complete that it could afford to be selectively vulnerable, so strategically sophisticated that it could choose authentic connection when such connection served love and growth rather than manipulation and control. This was perhaps the deepest paradox of emotional mastery. The strongest position was not perfect invulnerability, but perfect discernment about when vulnerability served strength and when detachment was necessary. The man who could never be destroyed by others was not the man who could never be affected by others, but the man who could choose consciously when and how to be affected based on his own deepest wisdom rather than unconscious psychological patterns. In the quiet of his study, Marcus understood that his transformation was not complete. It might never be complete. But the foundation was solid. He had destroyed the weak self that could be manipulated, controlled, and emotionally hijacked by others. In its place, he had constructed something far more valuable, a conscious self that could choose its responses based on wisdom rather than reactivity, strategy rather than impulse, love rather than fear. The path forward would require continued integration of these seemingly contradictory capacities: strategic thinking and authentic feeling, emotional mastery and conscious vulnerability, personal sovereignty and genuine connection. But Marcus now possessed the psychological architecture to navigate these complexities with increasing wisdom and effectiveness. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, but the ultimate expression of that strength is the ability to choose consciously when to be affected by others, when to remain strategically distant, and when to surrender control for the sake of love and authentic human connection. This was not the end of emotional mastery, but its true beginning. In the end, the greatest victory is not over others, but over the unconscious patterns within ourselves that make us vulnerable to others' manipulation. The man who achieves this victory discovers that true strength lies not in perfect invulnerability, but in perfect consciousness, the ability to choose our responses based on wisdom rather than reactivity, strategy rather than impulse, love rather than fear. This is the silent path to absolute control, not control over others, but such complete control over ourselves that we can afford to be selectively vulnerable when vulnerability serves our highest purposes.